Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm making the saint dress out of this really lovely linen fabric, and I'm using the pattern from this book by designer Ann Ringstrand. And this book is in Swedish, and I've made a lot of things from this book, but today I'm having a go at the saint dress. So the saint dress is a shirt dress based on a oversized shirt and really basic structure. And I will make some changes to it, but I really like the look of this, even though I think my dress will turn out a bit more casual, and I will make it a bit shorter too. So just come along. Okay, so the first step is to attach some facing, but I'll start by making sure all my pieces are really flat and nice. So shiny side down, and I'm ironing this on, and this is the pocket. And then I'm moving on to the color, and I skipped one part of the color, so I'm just doing the color stand. I think that will be really nice. So next up is removing the pattern and some more facing to press, and this time it's along the front edges of the shirt or the dress. So I'm aligning my interfacing pieces and ironing them, and this time I was a bit efficient, so I did it both of them at the same time. And then I started folding the bottom bands in and pressing them. So I used two different techniques. For the first one, I folded the outer edge first, and the second one, I folded the inner edge first and then folded it in. I'm also placing some pins to keep this in place while I keep working. So I'm going back to the pocket and I'm going to start sewing, but as always, before you sew any folded edges, you need to give it a good press. So I'm folding the bottom edge. Okay, so I'm stitching the top of the pocket down with a slightly longer stitch, and then I go back into ironing the edges. So I'm taking out the one of the front pieces, and I'm placing my pattern on top. And this is to find where to place the pocket. And actually, I did change the pocket placement a little bit. I placed it about 6 centimeters above the original placement because I didn't like the way it looked when it was really low, placed really low. So I'm pinning this and I'm going to sew all the way around. I'm stitching this down with about 2 millimeters seam allowance from the edge of the pocket. So in order to know exactly where to place all my buttons, I have used this red or pink thread, and I'm using the pattern on top of my pieces, and then I'm just pushing the thread through and leaving it there with a little knot so it stays to show me the placement of the buttons. And I chose these really nice yellow buttons, and then I repeated the same with the button band for the buttonholes. And now it's time to start putting the dress together, and we start with the back and the back yoke, and the yoke comes in 2 pieces, so I'm placing the back piece in between the yoke pieces. And then of course this needs to be pressed really well. And then next up is the shoulder seams. So I'm placing the front pieces on top of the back piece, and I'm pinning just with the top layer of the yoke, and I folded the bottom layer of the yoke down. And now I'm going to do the burrito method to pin the other side of the yoke shoulder seam. So I'm doing a 3-layer seam up on the shoulder with the front and back pieces rolled up in between, so everything is encased inside the yoke pieces. This creates a hidden seam and you get a really clean finish at the shoulders and the back. Okay, so it's time to flip this right side out, and I'm just pulling the dress out through the side hole there where the sleeve is supposed to go. And this looks really nice. And of course I did give that a press. So it's time for the color, and I'm pinning the 2 parts together, right sides together. I'm going to stitch along the top edge. And then I'm cutting down the seam allowance, about half of it, so I'm left with about 5 millimeters of seam allowance. And then I'm pressing the two parts apart so I can get a nice clean edge. And then on one of the pieces I fold the inner edge 1 centimeter. I'm sorry, I fold both edges 1 centimeter all the way around the bottom. And then I start pinning it to the back, and note that I'm pinning this from the wrong side. This is to create a nice clean look when I stitch the outer edge of the collar. I really try to match up all the edges and little notches that I have from the pattern. Okay, so now that it's sewn onto one side, I need to fold the edge over, make sure the folded edge that I ironed before on the outside covers the stitches I got from the seam line I just did, and pinning it carefully in place. And then I sew one more time, and I did this with about a 2 millimeter distance to the edge. And I actually kept going all the way around the color to create a nice look at top of the color also. And then of course I need to mark out the buttonhole and the button placement on the collar too. I'm doing this exactly the same way as I did on the button band. And then I started by overlocking the edges or the side seams of the dress and pinned them together, right sides together, of course. And went over to my sewing machine and stitched those with 1 centimeter seam allowance. I did make this dress a lot shorter because I didn't have that much fabric. So I shortened it quite a bit, but I still think this length was really nice. And now I also stitched along the button bands. This is not something that is recommended in the book, but I decided to do it because I felt it would look nice on this dress. And then the next step is to start working the sleeves. And the first step is to sew the underarm seams together, or the side seams of the sleeve. And then of course I sewed that together and also overlocked the edge. So I lost the footage of me sewing with the sewing machine, but I found the ones with me overlocking. So here's the part where I overlocked, where I ironed, and then I start folding the bottom edge. I folded 1 centimeter first, and then 2.5 centimeters, I believe. This is also something a bit different from the original pattern, because the original pattern states that you should do a double layered sleeve and sew that together, so you just have like a double sleeve. I didn't have enough fabric to do that, so I just did this ordinary hem of the sleeve instead. Okay, so the next step is to attach the sleeves to the armhole, and I use all of these little notches. One thing that's really great about this book and the patterns in these books is that the patterns are really well made, and you can really trust the little notches and things that you have in there. Um, on the negative side, I think the written instructions in the book isn't always that easy to understand. I claim to be a quite uh, experienced sewist, but I um, I still struggle understanding what the instructions mean sometimes, and I not attaching the sleeves maybe, but other parts from the book where you have a bit more advanced techniques. But I really enjoy working from this book um, because all the garments have a really nice, clean, and professional finish to them, and you get clothes that doesn't really look homemade, so to speak. They look more like a fashion fashion brand, and the designer is also designing clothes for the market where you can buy her clothes, and I think it's a design like called Hope. So I pressed the seam allowance towards the body of the dress and stitched this down with a straight stitch from the outside. Okay, so moving on to the hem, and since this is a really curved hem, I'm using a technique where you sew it with a longer stitch first, and I sew this about 5 millimeters from the edge, and then I use these longer stitches to help the fabric curve, and now that I'm ironing, I'm folding just along the stitch line. So this has two purposes basically. First of all, helping the fabric to bend inwards, and secondly, it's a lot easier to fold the hem exactly where you want it to be folded when you have the stitch line, because you kind of naturally create a fold there. Of course, this part here is a bit tricky, but it works. I made that part a little thinner actually. So after folding it once, I pull the threads a little bit again, and I fold it a second time, and I ended up with a hem roughly 1 centimeter wide. I think I might have sewn the first stitches just 8 millimeters maybe from the edge, and then I'm stitching this hem down. I must say, all of this ironing, even if it takes a lot of time, it really helps when you get to these stages, because sewing a thin hem or a hem along a curved line like this usually creates a lot of puckers, but I do not experience that problem with this technique, so I recommend this. And then I decided to stitch down the side seams like I did around the sleeves, because I thought it would create a nicer, cleaner look. Didn't really add anything to the function, but just thought it looked like really professional. And then I'm starting to do my buttonholes. Of course, I made a few test runs first to decide the size, and I have this really clever little digital tool that helps me to measure out the buttonholes and just automatically create everyone the same. Of course, I could have used a more standard buttonhole presser foot where you measure it, but my machine comes with this little device, and that's really handy when it comes to sewing buttonholes. And then it's time to start sewing on the buttons, and a quite tedious work, but also just adding those finishing touches is really nice. So I sewed the buttons quite loosely on, and then gave them a little bit of a neck, a little bit wider here on the top, but I did this all the way around to make sure the buttons would sit nicely through the top layer. And then of course opening up all the buttonholes. I always open them up with a seam ripper going from the outer edges towards the center, and I make sure that I don't push my seam ripper, just push it forward. I always point the tip up through the buttonhole halfway so you don't accidentally open up the buttonhole edges where you just sewn. I know some people actually place a pin in the end to make sure that you have a secure stop if you accidentally go too far. So I added about 8 or 10 buttons on this, so it took a while, but I believe this was the last one. And this is how it turned out. I'm really happy with the design. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.